Welcome to Broad Street to Brideshead. In this episode, we will be exploring the life and writing of one of the first women to get a degree from Oxford. Although the university had been open to women in 1879, women were not permitted to receive degrees until 1920, and one of the first recipients of this qualification was Vera Brittain. Britain lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in British history. These events undoubtedly had a huge influence on her writing, her politics, and her relationships with the people around her. So today I'm joined by Mark Bostridge, author of Vera Brittain, A Life, to explore with him how Britain's life was shaped by her time at Oxford, what women's colleges were like in the early 20th century, and Britain's writing career after she graduated from Somerville in 1921. Mark Bostridge, thank you so much for joining me today, and very excited to talk to you about Vera Brittain. So I wanted to start before Vera Brittain arrives in Oxford, because I believe she first encounters Oxford through the extension scheme, and I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what that was and how that encouraged her to go to Somerville in the end.
Well, the Oxford Extension Scheme was set up, I think, in about 1870, and the idea was to introduce women to tertiary education, to kind of standard of university education, even if they didn't go to university, because Vera Brittain is quite unusual to want to go to Oxford in 1913-14, because she comes from a well-off family. There's no chance that she's going to be a teacher, for instance. The likelihood is that she'll make a good marriage. And so it's not really expected that she would go to university. And you have to remember that in Britain, at any case, a very, very small percentage of the female population goes to universities until the 1950s. So anyway, the extension scheme was a way of lecturers going to different parts of Britain, giving courses. And Vera Brittain went to one of these started going to one in Buxton, where she lived, in 1913. And the man who gave the lectures on industrial history, on trade union history, was a man called John Marriott. And he was very impressed with the standard of Vera Brittain's essays, which were obviously a lot better than most of the Buxtonians. And so he encouraged her to go to a summer school at Oxford, because they had summer schools. And so she went to a summer school, I think in the summer of 1913, with one of her aunts, who'd been the headmistress, the co-headmistress of her school in Surrey. And then she basically tutored herself to sit the examinations. She was told not to apply to Somerville, because Somerville had the reputation of being a very hard college to get into at that time. But she did, and she was awarded an exhibition in 1914. In those days, you had to sit two exams. You had to sit the college entrance exam and another university entrance exam. And so she only receives the news that she's succeeded in both these exams on the eve of the First World War. So she actually goes up to Oxford in October 1914, just a couple of months after the war has started.
We all know that the early 20th century was a rather mixed time in opinions on women's rights and liberation. There were those who were extremely supportive. Graham Moffat founded the Northern Men's League for Women's Suffrage in Glasgow in 1907. Others were somewhat less enthusiastic. Sir James Grant, MP for Whitehaven, pronounced, "We are controlled and worried enough by women." And Rowland Hunt, MP for Ludlow, put forward this stunning protestation that women should not be allowed in Parliament because how is a poor little man to get on with a couple of women wearing enormous hats in front of him? There are obvious disadvantages about having women in Parliament, and I do not know what is going to be done about their hats. He seems particularly hung up on this issue. So where did Vera Brittain's family sit? Were they pioneers of women's education? Or did Vera have to fight tooth and nail for her right to go to university?
Well, the kind of provincial town she came from, which was very inward-looking, very snobbish, Buxton, you wouldn't have expected a young woman of Vera Brittain's class. Her father was the owner of a paper mill, so they had quite a lot of money. And Buxton itself was sort of stuffed with people who worked in families who worked in cotton in Manchester. There was a lot of money around, and you just wouldn't really have expected a woman like Vera Brittain, who was attractive, very pretty, to have gone to university. So I don't think her father was necessarily very supportive at first, although in the end he ended up paying the fees. But contrary to the account she gives in Testament of Youth, her autobiography, which covers, going to Oxford and then becoming a VAD nurse in the war, contrary to that account, her mother was very supportive, and her mother actually went to the extension lectures sometimes with her in Buxton. But in the way of autobiography, Vera Brittain is constructing a story, so she makes it seem much harder than it actually probably was. I mean, it was hard. I mean, she worked largely by herself. She passed in 1914. Your first exams, even though she was applying to read English, were classical ones, so she had to take Responsions Greek in order to proceed with the rest of the course, and she basically had very little outside Greek teaching. So it was difficult in that respect, but she in the way she wants to make herself out as different and as an outsider and as fighting against all these forces, she had more support than she gives the impression she did.
As Mark Bostridge mentioned, Vera Brittain went to Oxford on the eve of the First World War, and indeed she did not stay long. After just 1 year at university, she signed up for the VAD. The Voluntary Aid Detachment was a group organised by the British Red Cross and St John Ambulance, and these were volunteers who were predominantly women, who served as nurses in hospitals and aid stations in England and abroad. And they filled in the gaps left by professional nurses who'd been called up. So they did the cooking, the cleaning, and they also administered some basic medical care to patients. Vera Brittain served in this detachment until the end of the war. So how did this massive upheaval of her studies affect her, both during and after the war? What happened to her contemporaries? Were there people she knew who went off to fight? Did they come back? And how was women's war work viewed by the population at home at the time and in the years after?
Well, when she went up to Oxford in the autumn of 1914, she still expected that the man she was beginning to have a growing attraction to, Roland Leighton, who had won a postmastership to Merton, that he would be going to Oxford with her. She had this kind of sort of idea that they'd spend 3 years at Oxford together. Also, her brother had got into New College. And then that changed quite swiftly, because in common with many men of their class and generation, Edward, her brother, and Roland, her fiancé, the man that became her fiancé, decided they wanted to enlist. And so Roland, in fact, goes to the front in March 1915. Edward doesn't actually go until 1916, and he's in Oxford for a while training with the OTC, but he never actually goes up to New College. And Oxford University after the war had a different policy. Each college had a different policy, the men's colleges, on how they would memorialise these men. So Edward, who never went to Oxford, isn't on the New College War Memorial, but Roland, who also never matriculated, is actually on the Merton War Memorial. You can see his name there. So that was essentially what changed Vera Brittain's perception of her time at Oxford, that she realised that she wanted to do something for the war effort, and obviously as a woman she couldn't fight. She considered various other options. Probably the most difficult option was to nurse. The Bishop of Oxford in 1914-15 got up in his pulpit in St Mary's and made a great impassioned plea that women shouldn't go off and do war work. There was this sort of idea that women should be passive and sort of preserve the values of the country was fighting for by staying put. And although other Somervillians did go off to do war work, Vera Brittain was one of quite a few. One of very few. And that caused problems really when she went back to Oxford after the war, because by that time she was almost 25. And of course, her contemporaries by then were girls who just left school, who hadn't been in the war and had really no ideas about the war. And so that created a sort of chasm in experience between Vera Brittain and her other contemporaries at college.
From Winifred to Vera, on the 20th of October, 1921. My dear little heart, it has been a wonderful time, dearest. But you know, the best thing of all was finding out from day to day how dear you are. The journey would have been pleasant in most circumstances, and interesting in any, but because you were there, it was wholly delightful. Whatever things may happen in the future of good or evil, at least we've had one perfect time which nothing can take away. Our actions all have immortality. Such gladness gives no hostage unto death. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being so completely satisfactory, you most sweet woman. And we will go again. There are heaps of lovely places to see and things to do. Never doubt I want to see and do them, and that I ask no better travelling companion than you. Good night. May that God, whom you and I both in our different ways worship, bless you and keep you, and let the light of his countenance shine upon you and give you peace. Good night. Winifred. When Vera Brittain returned to Oxford after the war, it was a very different place. Faces, attitudes, politics had all changed beyond recognition. Brittain felt displaced and alone. However, during her second stint at Oxford, Vera did meet one exceptionally close friend, the author of the letter you have just heard, a woman named Winifred Holtby. So who was Winifred? How did they meet? Was it an instant connection, or more enemies to friends? And how did their relationship change and develop over the years?
They were both tutored by the Dean of Hertford's C.R.M.F. Gratwell, and they didn't get on at all well at first, because Vera Brittain had lost her fiancé, her brother, and two other friends in the war, and she was very withdrawn, quite prickly, was very sort of hurt in a way that Somerville weren't more supportive of her when she went back to Oxford, because she had been in VAD in London, in Malta, and in France. And in France, she'd obviously been at really horrifying operations, and she was suffering in a sense from post-traumatic stress disorder, and so she was in a really bad way. And actually, the only tutor that really supported her was a woman called Hilda Lorimer. And if you go to Somerville today, you can see a portrait of Hilda Lorimer that was actually paid for by Vera Brittain, because she realised how much she owed her. Because Hilda Lorimer, who was the classics tutor, who was an expert on Homeric archaeology, had actually gone off and done war work of her own. She'd gone to Salonika as an orderly in a hospital. So Vera Brittain didn't get on with Winifred Holtby, who was I suppose, very cheerful, popular, probably slightly loud individual. And so Vera Brittain rather looked down her nose at her. Winifred Holtby had done a small amount of war work, because she'd gone up to Somerville in 1917, and then she left Somerville and joined the WACS as a driver, and then eventually she'd done some nursing in a civilian hospital, but nothing like what Vera Brittain had been through. And also Winifred Holtby hadn't lost anybody close to her during the war. And one of the things that brings them together is, I suppose, Winifred Holtby learning more about the war and about Vera Brittain's own losses during the war. But there is this terrible event that Vera Brittain writes about, both in her fiction and in Testament of Youth, the Somerville debate, where Vera Brittain is held up to ridicule because she has spent so much time going on to the other undergraduates about the war and the fact that they didn't live through it, didn't go through it, and so that they have really started to dislike her. So they decided to take her down a peg by getting her to propose a motion at the Somerville debate. And Winifred Holtby is one of the organisers of this and takes part in the debate. And the motion is something like, is it better to travel for 4 years or to have academic experience? And Vera Brittain is very against Oxford because she thinks Oxford is very enclosed. She's come back to Somerville having originally read English but wanting to change to history because she wants to understand the origins of the war, but except that the Oxford course stops in 1878. So she's quite bitter about Oxford. And the principal, Miss Penrose, who was one of the extraordinary women who got women degrees, because of course Winifred and Vera are among the first women to actually take degrees in the Sheldonian in 1921. So there's a lot of hostility towards Vera Brittain, and Vera Brittain herself is scathing about the other undergraduates, but predictably Vera Brittain loses the notion that travel is preferable to 4 years at university. But after that, gradually Vera Brittain and Winifred Holby become closer because they both want to be writers. And Vera Brittain has already had a volume of war poetry published in 1918. Winifred Holby is writing her first novel, and so is Vera Brittain during the period 1919 to 21 when she's up at Somerville for the second time.
2 years after graduation, in 1923, Vera Brittain publishes her first novel. It is called The Dark Tide. And the main character, Daphne Lethbridge, opens the novel returning to Oxford after a period of voluntary war work. Sound familiar? The novel is quite clearly, unashamedly in fact, a depiction of Somerville. The descriptions of the dons, other students, and college life are clearly based on Brittain's own experiences. So what can this novel tell us about how Vera Brittain viewed Oxford after she left its hallowed halls? Does she look back in anger, in love, in hatred, or in happiness? And how was the novel received by the members of the institution it portrayed?
Like a lot of people who go to Oxford, their time there falls into different phases. Perhaps they're happier, perhaps they're more motivated, perhaps they're more fulfilled in their first or second year than they are in their third year.
Yes.
I mean, Vera Brittain's case, it's exaggerated because of course the war sort of comes crashing down on it. I mean, she was very idealistic, very happy to be at Oxford in her first year, which is 1914-15. She goes down in the summer of 1915. And of course, Somerville is a famous sort of writers' academy, if you like. There's something called the Somerville School of Novelists, which is, as it's dubbed, in the 1920s. Because if you look at Vera Brittain's first year college picture, you'll see Dorothy L. Sayers was her contemporary. But before that, there were novelists like Rose Macaulay. Almost contemporary with Vera Brittain is Margaret Kennedy, who wrote The Constant Nymph, which was a big bestseller in the 20s. So Somerville had that reputation, a writer's college. But then, of course, in 1919, when she returns, she's a very much changed person. And she does, as I said, feel that Oxford is sort of hidden from the world, or sort of it doesn't take into account outside forces. And the way she has changed is that she is committed to two major causes. One is feminism and the other is peace. So while she's back at Somerville, or at least shortly afterwards, she joins the League of Nations Union to support the League of Nations. She also joins the 6 Point Group, which is a group for feminists post women had won the vote. Women over 30 and over had won the vote in 1918, and so there's a post-suffragette society called the 6 Point Group, which she joins, and actually converts Winifred Holby to these ideas. But there's no doubt that she found Oxford very difficult after the war. When she came to write her first novel, it was natural for her to satirize and caricature certain aspects of Oxford. I mean, The Dark Tide, published in 1923, is a bad novel, but it's an intriguing book because it's intriguing both from a historical and an autobiographical point of view. And if you read the first part of the novel, it's very close to Vera Brittain's Oxford experiences. It's the main character, Virginia Dennison, or one of the main characters, Virginia Dennison, based on Vera Brittain, very pretty, well-dressed, has been a nurse in the war, has lost men close to her, comes back to Somerville after the war. And then there's another character, Daphne Lethbridge, who is based on Winifred Holtby. And so people were horrified that Daphne Lethbridge is basically based on Winifred and caricatures her as this clumsy individual who is criticised in tutorials for not being able to write proper sentences and so on and so forth. It is a very strange novel, but there are other elements in it which are also based on fact. One is that Somerville had a very good medieval historian who came to Somerville during the war, called Maud Clark, who died young in 1935. She was a great medievalist. And Vera Brittain wrote a poem called Lament of the Demobilised. It's quite a famous poem, in which she's basically criticising Maud Clark for having taken a position as a history tutor that might have been Vera Brittain's had she not had to go to the war. It's a very... and Maud Clark also appears in The Dark Tide in the character of Patricia O'Neill, and the same kind of relationship is portrayed. Also in The Dark Tide, you have Lewis Namier, who was a young history don. He's also portrayed. And Crutwell, before Evelyn Waugh, is portrayed as Raymond Sylvester, who is the sort of baddie, the man that brings Daphne Lethbridge down because he marries her. So it was a scandal. It caused a small scandal, this novel, when it was published, because you just didn't, make fun of an Oxford college, and especially an Oxford women's college, when the colleges have worked so hard to get degrees for women. So it did cause scandal, and Vera Brittain thought she'd been put under a ban by Somerville. And it really wasn't until the success of Testament of Youth in 1933 that she was invited back to Somerville on high table, and in their very muted way, she received their congratulations, such as they were. But subsequent to that, both her children went to Oxford. Her husband had been to Oxford, and she returned to Somerville sometimes because the principal of Oxford by that time was Janet Vaughan, who had actually been the woman the undergraduate at Somerville who brought Vera and Winifred together after the debate. And then in 1960, Vera Brittain wrote a book called The Women at Oxford, which is a non-fiction study of women, the fight for the degree at Oxford, and also for the establishment of women's colleges.
Vera Brittain's first encounters with Oxford were as an attendee of Oxford's extension scheme. And in 1926, Brittain came full circle, herself delivering a series for the extension scheme titled Ideals of World Unity at Westgate-on-Sea. So how did she come to decide on this subject to lecture on? And what can her decision tell us about the young woman's political orientation and beliefs?
So after Oxford, both she and Winifred did some teaching, and the League of Nations was very important to both of them. The League of Nations was this body that was going to stop wars in future by using military power to step in and prevent countries going to war. It's not a pacifist body. Vera Brittain doesn't become a pacifist till 1937 when she joins the Peace Pledge Union. But obviously it was the great hope of that generation that it would stop another war after the supposed war to end all wars. And so one of the things that the League of Nations Union, which Vera Brittain joined in after she came down from Oxford, was to go around the country giving lectures about the League of Nations. And that's primarily, I think, what she was doing at Oxford when she took part in the summer schools. It was trying to get people's support for the League of Nations, which is, up and running and still very much a going cause until the mid-30s. So that was very significant. She also was a very prominent feminist, young feminist in her journalism. She did a lot of journalism, for instance, for Time and Tide. And so she talked about issues like that too, because there's the post-suffragette arguments about women getting equality and what that kind of equality would mean.
From Vera to Winifred, 31st of March, 1932. Darling, I thought you'd like to see this excellent review by Priestley of Phyllis Bentley's book. It should make its fortune, I should think. PB, I suppose, is certain to get it with her press cuttings. Could you let me know her address? I should like to write to her. Dr. Gray has just this minute phoned to say she has fixed your appointment with Halsdally for 5 o'clock next Thursday. This seems a splendid time. You can stay in bed all morning and come up in the afternoon. Can you find a good train time which leaves High Wycombe about 3 o'clock? Dr. G has asked me to meet you and take you to the specialist as she can't get there much before 5 o'clock owing to a clinic. We could have some tea somewhere first. Then you can come back here and have dinner in bed, and I will take you back next day. All love, VSVDL. Winifred Holtby has come up a lot, and with good reason. From 1921 to the end of her life, Winifred Holtby was Vera Brittain's closest friend and ally. We've heard how they both became teachers and writers. But how else did their relationship develop? Who really was Winifred Holtby? And what did these two women mean to each other?
One of Winifred Holtby's early novels is a wonderful book called The Crowded Street. I think it's published in 1924, in which she portrays a friendship between a sort of gregarious, cheerful, popular young woman and a much more sort of spiky, difficult, small, dark-haired woman. And this is basically the relationship between her and Vera Brittain in fiction. So it's kind of getting her own back on the portrayal in The Dark Tide. And one of the things that Winifred Holtby said on her deathbed, because she died young, she died at the age of 37 in 1935, she said to Vera Brittain, "You made me." And what she meant by that is that she opened Winifred's mind to the causes of feminism and peace, which they were both dedicated to. It has to be said that Winifred Holtby was, I think, really a much better writer than Vera Brittain. I mean, they both wrote great books. They wrote one great book each. Winifred Holtby wrote a novel called South Riding, which was published posthumously 90 years ago next March, in March 1936. South Riding, based on her life in the Yorkshire wolds when she was growing up and on her mother's position as the first woman alderman in Yorkshire, in near Hull. And then, of course, Vera Brittain wrote Testament to Youth in 1933. After Oxford, they chose to live in a series of flats together while they tried to get a foothold in the journalistic world. So they lived in two flats in Doughty Street and then one in Maida Vale. If you go to Doughty Street, there's a blue plaque on one of the houses where they lived. And so they were very supportive of each other, because Vera Brittain wanted desperately for 10 years really to write a book about the war, but had great difficulty in trying to decide whether it should be fiction or something else. So she writes numerous sort of unfinished fictional versions of her war experiences, and she's not exactly not exactly easy to live with. And one of the things that she's very honest about in Testament of Youth is her mortification when she discovers that Winifred's novel, Anne to be Wold, her first novel, has been accepted by a publisher when her first novel is being rejected. And she was older than Winifred. She was 5 years older than Winifred. She'd been expected. She wanted to be the star, and here was Winifred coming along and publishing her first novel first. So there was always, in any kind of relationship with Vera Brittain, there was always this competitiveness. I mean, I think most people would have felt this. But what is extraordinary is, and I suppose what you'd call an example of the behaviour of new women in the 1920s, is that when Vera Brittain married in 1925, Winifred Holtby became part of her household that she set up with her husband. So they lived together. And because her husband was lecturing in America, he was a political scientist, he was away for part of the year. And during that part of the year, it was just Vera and Winifred in the house. And when Vera Brittain had children, Winifred, who never had children and never married, became a kind of honorary aunt to them. I mean, the thing about Winifred Holby is because she died so young, it's difficult to know what would have happened to their relationship. And certainly it was changing. It changed. I think Winifred Holby wanted to live separately from the family because it was difficult for her sometimes to concentrate or with children. And I think she probably would have decided to live alone. Also, as I said, she only had one very unsatisfactory relationship with this man who never offered to marry her, and there's always been some sort of question over Winifred's sexuality and whether she was sexually attracted to Vera Brittain. They certainly didn't have a lesbian relationship, but I'm sure that Vera Brittain didn't have lesbian feelings for Winifred, but I can't be so sure of the reverse.
Mark Bostridge has previously mentioned how Vera Brittain became a pacifist in 1937 when she joined the Peace Pledge Union. However, the years after this were a time of great nationalist fervour. Particularly during the Second World War, feelings of the rightness and justness of the war against Nazis were running high. So how did this affect Vera Brittain both personally and in relation to her book sales? Did she give up her pacifism, bowled over by the torrent of warmongering? Or did she hold on to her values even when it turned many against her?
I mean, Vera Brittain wrote 29 books up to her death in 1970. And I think it's very difficult for a writer who has a big success to go on having successes. And especially difficult for a woman who was ransacking her own life and constantly writing about her experience in the First World War in different forms. And I find it rather sad that, her later career in the 50s and 60s, she's writing non-fiction books like The Women at Oxford, which, are okay, but, you just feel you're writing for the sake of publishing something because you're a writer. As far as her career post-1933 is concerned, she becomes a sponsor of the Peace Pledge Union, which is the biggest peace organisation in Britain in 1937, under the charismatic leadership of Canon Dick Shepherd. And pacifism is a very popular cause in the 30s. I mean, people join these pacifist organisations, and especially the PPU, in a desperate attempt to try and stop another war. By 1940, of course, with the threat of invasion, a lot of pacifists have changed their mind and decided they must renege on that pacifism. That's true of a lot of the members of the PPU, but it isn't true of Vera Brittain. It really was her faith and a very important component in her life. In 1940, she published a biography of Winifred Holby called Testament of Friendship, which was a big seller and very popular. During the war, she writes pacifist works and novels, and the novels continue to sell well, even though they become more like pacifist propaganda. There are two, Born 1925 and Account Rendered, both published in the 40s, in which she seems much more like a propagandist than a sort of creative writer. But they're still successful. Her standing in America was much more affected. I mean, she'd had big sales in America. She'd been a bestseller in America after Testament of Youth. And it's affected because she attacks the Allied policy of the saturation bombing of German cities. And that causes a great furore and controversy in America, and her sales do fall in America as a consequence. But part of her problem as a writer is that she wanted to be the thing she wasn't, like many people. She wanted to be a novelist, and she really wasn't a novelist. What she was good and at times very distinguished in doing was using her own experience to create an extraordinary sense of period and an understanding of the First World War, because Testament of Youth is now probably much more widely read than the male books that created such a splash at the end of the 20s and early 30s, like Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon and Edmund Blunden. Testimony of Youth, because it was made into a famous television series in the 1970s and then made into a film 10 years ago, has really kept its readership, even though it's not a particularly easy book to read for, I think, for today's younger generation, because it's very long. Perhaps I'm being unfair. I mean, in another way, I see Testimony of Youth differently, because I can see much more clearly now the extent to which it's untruthful in some senses, both about her response to the war, about, in a very small way, her upbringing, because it's much more a book written about the 1930s and a woman writing about her fears of the oncoming war than it is of a young woman living through 1914-18, even though Vera Brittain quotes from letters and diaries. So in one very obvious sense, she tries to pretend in Testimony of Youth that she was much more anti-war during the First World War than she was.
Right.
And it's obvious why she's doing that. She suppressed the fact that she encouraged her brother to enlist. That you won't find that in Testimony of Youth. But because her letters, her war letters, and her diaries have been published, we actually have the contemporary account to put beside it. In Winifred Holby's case, Winifred was a keen supporter of the League of Nations, as Vera Brittain was in the 20s and early 30s, up to her death in 35, which is the moment when the League of Nations is beginning to fail because of Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia. Whether Winifred Holby would have been a pacifist, I don't know. I think she would have found the unpopularity attached to going all out and saying war was wrong in any circumstances pretty hard to deal with. And whether it would have created a rift in her relationship with Vera Brittain, I don't know. But being a pacifist in 1940 was a very brave thing to do, even if you don't share those views and you feel that the country had to fight. I always remember Bernard Williams, who was a philosopher and Vera Brittain's son-in-law, saying that although he wasn't a pacifist, he felt he had no right to criticise or question Vera Brittain's pacifism because it was born out of the suffering she had seen at first hand while nursing on the Western Front in 1917-18.
Interesting. So just thinking about the various stories and episodes we've heard from her life so far, she seems to me to be someone who is very determined and almost sort of single-minded. Like, she decides to educate herself pretty much for Oxford. She decides to serve as a nurse for 3 years of the war, and then she sticks with this pacifism even though it's not in vogue. Would you agree? Would you say?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the most extraordinary thing about her, is her single-mindedness, her determination, her willingness to be unpopular. I mean, when she came up to Oxford in 1914, she said, well, naturally, I've got my usual reputation as being the lion of the year. That she thought, I mean, she was outstanding as a young student at Oxford. But that also made her quite unpopular throughout her life. I mean, she never made easy relationships with people. She was quite a shy person in some respects. And one of the most extraordinary stories that came out of writing her biography years ago was that there were still aged women around who'd been students at Somerville when Vera Brittain had come back after the war. And one of them remembered the dark tide and its unpopularity at Somerville, and how she and a group of other undergraduates in Somerville had met in the Covered Market Cafe to criticise the book. And then one of them burned the book page by page in her mother's back garden. So it shows you how strongly felt these things were and how strongly felt the caricature of Somerville was. I mean, of course, is it 10 years later? About 10 years later, Dorothy L. Sayers writes Gaudy Night, which is a Lord Peter Wimsey novel set in a college that's obviously Somerville. I don't know whether that elicited the same kind of disapproval from Somerville. Possibly they were quite pleased by then to have the spotlight shone on them, because it wasn't critical of Oxford in the way that the Dark Tide is. I mean, I think, it's a very difficult time for women at Oxford in the lead up to the granting of degrees in 1921, because they have to be very well behaved in case the university will not allow degrees to women to be awarded. And if you think that Cambridge, which always seems a much more misogynistic university, waited until 1948 to give women degrees, you see how. And even Oxford, I think, restricted the number of women undergraduates until 1957. So it's a period that, opening up all sorts of possibilities for women outside marriage and the home, but it's also nevertheless still a very difficult period for them, where their roles are still being questioned.
I wanted to ask you about this, and how, just a sort of more broad general question now, about how going to university as a woman would have changed the trajectory of your life, or would it have that much? Would it have been more like a delaying tactic almost until you have to get married, or would it have been something that did open up the possibility of getting a job and earning your own income? Is that, yeah.
I mean, Vera Brittain's father, one of the reasons, I don't know whether it's true, whether he actually said this, but he said that she'd never get married if she became a blue stocking. I mean, I think there was this common perception that women went to universities were dowdy and not going to improve their chances of making a good marriage. And obviously Vera Brittain wasn't dowdy. She was very pretty. She was very well dressed. She expected to get married because she expected to be able to have everything, to be able to have a career, have children, and have a husband. I think the trajectory for women going up to Oxford in 1914, of course, some of them went home and did get married, but an awful lot of them went into teaching in various guises. I mean, some, for instance, there's one of Vera Brittain's contemporaries in 1914 is an academic called Una Ellis Fermor, who later became a very distinguished, I think, Renaissance scholar. And of course, writing, whether as a journalist or as a fiction or a non-fiction writer, was an obvious opening for women to try and earn their livings, and middle-class women. So I think it did change the trajectory. It'd be interesting to look at the statistics for, those early women in the during the war and in the 20s, and see actually how many of them did establish careers. But I think, a large proportion of them did. I mean, it might only have been being a librarian or being a school teacher, but I think it definitely made an enormous impact on the position of women in the first half of the 20th century.
Vera Brittain has had such a fascinating life, in her writing, in her politics, in the momentous events of history that she lived through. But this history is also still relatively recent, so I was just wondering if there is a place where people could go, where they might be able to find out more about Vera, or maybe even see some material from the time, if there's an archive open anywhere where a curious visitor could have a look, maybe at some letters or photographs left over from the period.
I suppose that the thing that is interesting to me now is that colleges like Somerville are very conscious of their history. I mean, all colleges at Oxford have to promote their history and be conscious of it. But Somerville has a remarkable history, and it has these remarkable writers all the way from, I don't know, Rose Macaulay right through to people like Iris Murdoch. And when the biography, the authorised biography of Vera Brittain was published 30 years ago, we decided to establish an archive at Somerville. And so a lot of the material that we'd used to write the book went to Somerville, and that's been added to over the years. So there is actually a very good collection. And when Vera Brittain's daughter, Shirley Williams, died a few years ago, we found the most extraordinary photographs, First World War photographs that I'd never seen, that she kept in boxes in her cellar or something and carried, from property to property throughout her life. These extraordinary albums. So Somerville now has this amazing collection, which is as far as the photographs is concerned, is a much better collection than the official archive of Vera Brittain, which is in Canada. And so anybody who's listening to this, if they're interested in studying Oxford and the First World War, or women writers in the First World War, or Vera Brittain or Winifred Holby, there is this extraordinary collection at Somerville, which I'm sure Somerville would only be too pleased to open to people and allow them to consult.
Vera Brittain was an immensely resilient woman for her time. A woman who had the force of character to go against her whole society in advocating for peace. Prepared to be disliked by the whole college for her opinions on war work and the naivety of the next generation. A woman who believed she could have everything, a degree, a family, a career, and went and got it. Thank you very much to Mark for coming on to talk to me today about this amazing woman's life, and thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed.